My name is Sarah Bagby. I'm the owner of Watermark Books and Cafe. Margaret Daw called us, I think, last year to partner with the new series that she started, Writing Now, Reading Now. And we were so excited to be a part of that series because of several reasons. One, it's the perfect melding of two communities, the academic community of people who write and read and are studying literature, and then also the community of an independent bookstore, which brings together people who really read and value what they can maybe not get. They're not in an academic community, so they come, they read reviews, they love to read, and they invest in reading. And so we can carry on because of that. So thank you all for your patronage in advance, or as you have already been there. I want to make a couple of thank yous to Margaret and the Center for Creative Writing for this lovely program. I want to thank the Ulrich Museum and Bob Borkman and Amy and every professional woman and man who works there. They're lovely to work with. And I also want to thank Alice McDermott's publisher, Farrar, Straus & Giroux, for being willing to take a chance on Wichita and Watermark and to provide expenses and transportation for Alice to come to Wichita. I'm going to give you kind of the nuts and bolts of Alice's writing career. She's the author of 7 novels, the latest of which is Someone. After this was a finalist for the 2006 Pulitzer Prize. Her 5th novel, Child of My Heart, was a Book of the Month Club main selection. Remember that? Book of the Month Club? I used to think they were my biggest competitor. And it was one of Book Magazine's 10 best novels of 2002, and it was also a nominee for the International Impact Dublin Literary Award. Her 4th novel, Charming Billy, received the 1998 National Book Award for Fiction, the American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation, and was shortlisted for the International Impact Dublin Literary Novel. Her 3rd book, At Weddings and Wake, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Her 2nd, That Night, was nominated for the National Book Award, the LA Times Book Award, Book Prize, the PEN/Faulkner Award, and was also a finalist for the Pulitzer. Her articles, reviews, and stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, the Atlantic Monthly, the New Yorker, Red Book, Ms., Commonwealth, Commonweal, elsewhere. She is the recipient of a Whiting Writers Award and the 2008 Corrigan Award for Literature. We're so happy she's in Wichita, and I give you Margaret Daw, Center for Creative Writing.
Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out. I already told this joke to a few friends, so forgive me. I went home this afternoon to relax, and I read The Eagle, and it said, hail and tornado tonight. Okay, thank you. First, thank you, Watermark Books and Cafe. Thank you so much, Amy from the Ulrich Museum, Kimberly Engberg, Emory Lindquist Honors Program, University Libraries, and the English Department for everyone's help with this. And thank you very much to the senators of the Student Government Association. On Wednesday evening, they voted to give this Writing Now, Reading Now series a hearty grant, and many of those students at that meeting spoke eloquently about how thrilled they were to know that by offering these readings of poetry and fiction, their university has told them that along with the many other beautiful applications of the human mind to this world, that writing, the building of gossamer constructions of words in ways that pull our hearts and minds along human paths, thicken us, fortify us as separate people, and will us into a community. All week in my classes, I've been leading my students in discussions of Alice McDermott's writing, specifically on the excerpt of her new novel, Someone, which appeared in the 2012 New Yorker magazine. For me, this writing has such personal meaning because it describes the New York Irish Catholic world my grandfather rendered every time a far look would come in his eyes, and he would clamp his hand on my nearest limb, and he would say, "Darlin', I must tell you a story." It was a time, he always told me, when these people knew they'd been born into very certain political and economic limits. "Darlin'," he'd say, "when I was growing up, either you became a priest or a cop." Oh, what limits, you might think, but no, you see, because what these people had, thanks to the scaffold of the Roman Catholic Mass they attended every week or day, was a way to form their world into stories about cruelty and comedy. And what they also had was the conviction that all of our human hot air was worth sharing with one another. I tried all week to say that that Irish Catholic cherishing of human stories was what Alice McDermott's writing announces. Her novel, Someone, brings us back to when ladies wear white gloves and hats and things called shirtwaists, and a man born with a crippled leg endures that because no one got surgery then to fix such a thing. No, all his life he would limp through a city where sunshine glances off the chrome of automobiles with fins. Don't you, I ask my students, want somehow to have been able to be alive in that world? And here we are now with the person who will give us that. Please welcome Alice McDermott to Wichita State University.
My goodness, thank you. What a lovely introduction, both introductions. Thank you so much for being here. I was reminded this evening, I grew up on Long Island, and all my relatives were from New York, and I married a guy from Ohio, and the first time I went out to meet the family, they took me for a drive out in the countryside outside of Columbus. And we were chatting in the car, and his father, very American, drove a big Cadillac, and we were just cruising. And all of a sudden, I heard this wailing siren out in the middle of nowhere, and it kept going and going. And finally, I interrupted them. I said, "Where is that siren coming from? What does it mean? There can't be a volunteer firehouse anywhere around here." And they looked at me and said, "Oh, no, it's a tornado warning." And then they kept talking. And I was terrified. I had something of that experience this evening as we were coming here. We just kept talking. I'm just going to give you a little taste of Someone. When you send a book out into the world, you never quite know what's going to happen. And the lovely thing about getting out on the road and hearing from readers and talking to readers is to get some little sense, unbiased sense of what your book is doing out there in the world. And this week, I met someone, and I also had an email from someone, two readers who one had said that there was a passage from the book that she read at her 35th wedding anniversary dinner last week. And the other one cited the exact same passage and said she read it after her husband's funeral. And I just heard about the anniversary today, which made me feel a little bit happier than the funeral. So I'm going to give you just I just had the impulse to read that part of the story to you without having to fill in too much. This is a novel about Marie Comerford. The novel is entirely given over to her voice. Those of you in the creative writing class who read the excerpt that was in the New Yorker, if you are astute, you will notice that the excerpt in the New Yorker is narrated in the third person, and yet the novel is narrated in the first person. Now, in my many years of teaching, every time a young writer would come into my office and say, "Oh, I can't get beyond the first page because I just can't make up my mind. Do I want a limited third person or do I want first person? I just can't get anything down because I can't make that decision." I have always said, "Oh, for God's sake, just make a decision, doesn't matter. They're practically the same thing, just keep writing. And then lo and behold, I found myself writing this novel almost entirely in the third person. And having that nagging, and those of you who write will know, that nagging sense of, I could stop there, but it's not right, and I need to do more work, and I need to figure out what's wrong. And what struck me was, one of the reasons I wanted to tell Marie's story was that I understood she was a character who had very little voice throughout her life. And she's a character who has very little voice in contemporary fiction as well. An average and ordinary, someone told me, said, don't call her ordinary, call her recognizable, which I sort of like. But not a celebrity, not a famous person, a familiar, recognizable, ordinary life across the whole span of it, but the life of a woman who really has not too much attention has been paid in her own life, in the world. So I realized very late in the process that in some way I, as her author, had done the same thing, and I needed to hand the book back to her and rewrite it in first person. This section comes, well, it's pretty obvious. Those of you who read the excerpt know she sort of didn't start out in her romantic life terribly well, but time goes on and she marries. So I had my wedding in the pretty church after all, squinting at myself in the narrow bathroom mirror, lovely in my makeup and my veil. I confessed to recalling another time. How's that, Mr. Hartnett, I thought. That's the first boyfriend, making eyes at my own reflection, Mr. Walter Hartnett. My brother Gabe walked me down the aisle and surprised me at the last minute by not merely kissing my cheek when we reached Tom, but pulling me into a firm embrace. We all joked about it later at the reception, like he was sending you off to the Foreign Legion, Tom said. Gabe laughed quietly, admitted, blushing, that he might have been a little overcome. There was so much to think about on such a day. I am the fool of loss, he said. You haven't lost a sister, Tom told him. You've gained me. God help you. That night, Tom lifted the blanket and I closed my eyes completely, even though the lights in the hotel room were already dim, only a thin shaft from along the bathroom door and the low glow of streetlights behind the thick curtains. There's not much to you, is there? He said. I was on my back, my hands folded together over my chest, so that I was aware of both the new wedding ring on one and the feel of my own heartbeat beneath the other. I wore the white nightgown, satin and lace that my mother had sewn. It was the centerpiece of my trousseau, and the provocative way my mother had worked the lovely lace into its bodice had come as some surprise to me. My mother, it seemed, knew things she had never spoken of. Take it or leave it, I told Tom with a laugh. I was dizzy with the champagne we had drunk. And Tom said, "Oh, I'll take it, if I may." There was the stirring touch of alcohol on his breath, the taste of champagne and sweet cake at the back of my throat, the faint, lingering scent of bleach on the hotel sheets and pillowcases, and it was either an indication of some expertise I didn't know he had, or of my mother's skill with fabric and needle and thread, that I was out of the lovely gown without the slightest effort on my part, without even opening my eyes. I was naive enough, drunk enough, to be surprised to find that a body could become a new thing altogether, shed of its clothes. Just as I was surprised to discover, not then, of course, but over time, that in the dark it would all remain unchanged. Skin, hair and limb, bone and blubber, scent and heartbeat and rhythm of breath. Unchanged as far as mouth was concerned, lips were concerned, a mystery revealed only to the long married. In the morning, In the pale hotel room, what a lot of strangeness. I reached for my glasses to see the time, just after 7 a.m. There was a brown-edged cigarette burn in the wood of the nightstand that I associated somehow with the narrow headache that was searing the center of my brain. My mouth was as dry as ash. Experience told me I would not go back to sleep. Whatever charm the room had had last night, with its low light and drawn shades and elegant silver bucket of champagne, hadn't exactly fled. I had never before, after all, spent a night in a place anything like the St. George Hotel. But there was a weirdness about it all at this hour of the morning, the light behind the pale green curtains and the rattling of the dark radiator, a door slamming somewhere, the revving of motors in the street. A disappointing sense of an ordinary day, even here in the lovely hotel, an ordinary day simply going on. Tom, this stranger, with his thin hair curled like a Coney Island Kewpie doll's above his pink face, was serenely asleep beside me. I found my nightgown on the floor, slipped into it, hardly a wrinkle. I was happy to discover good fabric, as my mother had said. The robe was on a chair in the corner. In the bathroom, I threw cold water on my face to relieve the headache. I brushed my teeth and rinsed my mouth and combed my hair and put on a little lipstick. In the movies, there would have been room service, a bellhop pushing a cloth-draped table into the room, ostrich feathers on my sleeve, but it was Sunday morning and we had to fast since we were meeting my mother and Gabe for 10 o'clock Mass. My mother would give us breakfast back home with all the wedding party invited. There would be some quiet kidding, no doubt, Tom's friends from the brewery especially. At the reception, one of them had crooned, "Oh, how we danced on the night we were wed. We danced and we danced 'cause the room had no bed." One had left a jar of Vaseline on the seat of the hired car when we left the reception, which Tom knocked to the floor, and I pretended I didn't see. The quote that these lovely readers let me know they used was, "I was naive enough, drunk enough, to be surprised to find that a body could become a new thing altogether shed of its clothes, just as I was surprised to discover, not then of course, but over time, that in the dark it would all remain unchanged. Skin, hair, and limb, bone and blubber, scent and heartbeat and rhythm of breath, unchanged as far as mouth was concerned, lips were concerned, a mystery revealed only to the long married." With that theme in mind, I thought I'd read just another brief piece. It strikes me, perhaps, and I'm happy to be corrected, not only are recognizable but ordinary women of a certain age without much beauty or excitement in their lives the subject of a lot of literary fiction, but I'm starting to think maybe not many long marriages either. So maybe one of the undercurrent themes of someone is that as well. And this chapter kind of addresses that. Marie is older. "Once, I woke to find that a black wheel, spoked with flashing silver, had settled behind my left eye. Tom had gotten up some time before. He was quietly bustling as he did these dark winter mornings of our late middle age, passing shadowy back and forth across the foot of the bed, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway. He was humming, as always, occasionally breaking into whispered song, his voice deep in his throat. Believe me, if all those endearing young charms. He was in undershirt and boxer shorts, and the room was filled with the scent of his soap and his shaving cream. Until I reached for my glasses, all of this was soft-edged and indistinct, all but the solid black image that had imposed itself over my vision. With my head still on the pillow, I put a cup palm over my right eye and then the left. It was in the left. Something's wrong, I said, sitting up slowly. There's something in my eye. He was abruptly silent. He crossed to my side of the bed, sat gingerly on the edge of the mattress. He placed a crooked finger under my chin to lift my face as he leaned toward me. I looked up to the shadowed ceiling so I would not blink. I could smell the toothpaste on his breath, the soap on his fleshy shoulders, the aftershave on his warm hand. I can't tell, he said. I told him to turn on the lamp. He leaned toward the bedside table, the mattress beneath me shifting with his weight. He turned back. Now the light cast across the ceiling was a spill of soft gold. He lifted my chin once again gently, even coyly, the prelude to a kiss, and peered again at my eyes. I can't see anything unusual, he said. It was my own fear, as well as my surprise at the shimmer of desire that touched the small of my back when he put his warm hand to my face, that made me speak to him so impatiently. Give me my glasses. He reached for them. I could have done this myself, and I slipped them on. I cupped my hand over my left eye, and the room settled into its distinct edges. I looked at his face, which was clear again. I could see the blush of irritation from his razor, a pinprick of blood on his cheek. Even then, he was smooth-skinned, although there were laugh lines drawn as if with a pencil in the corners of his eyes. His lips were thin and serious, his chin grown slack. It seemed a long time since I had looked at him this closely. I put my hand on my right eye, and the black wheel was imposed over everything. Something's wrong, I said again. I put my hand out as if to brush whatever it was away. There's a black thing in my left eye. I described a circle in the air before me and then tried to pluck at it again. I was aware of how foolish I must look, like a madwoman, in my thin nightgown, with my hair sleep-skewed, grabbing at nothing. There's flashing, I said, like spokes turning. I can't blink it away. I covered the left eye once more and then looked at him. I knew it was not unusual for husbands to become annoyed with sick wives. The neighborhood was filled with such tales. But Tom had tucked his chin into his throat, and the lines around his eyes were suddenly deeper. There was more concern than impatience in his face, and no impatience at all in his voice. Better call the doctor, he said. I heard him humming again in the kitchen as he waited for the doctor's service to pick up, the song and insistence that he was perfectly calm, that nothing much had changed in the last few minutes, nothing disruptive or insurmountable. I heard him explaining it all to my brother Gabe when he came downstairs for breakfast. Marie seems to have damaged her left eye, he said, sometime in the night. By late afternoon, I was wearing a pirate patch, and Tom was leading me to the admitting office of a hospital in Manhattan. Of course, churches should have been the touchstone places of our lives, a pair of Catholics such as we were. But in truth, it was the tiled corridors of these old urban hospitals that marked the real occasions of our life together. The births of our 4 children, my mother's death, the kids' tonsillectomies and appendectomies over the years, his hernia, Gabe's breakdown, and now this surgery tomorrow to repair my left eye. And wasn't it a corridor much like this that would provide the backdrop for our last parting? But Tom had his hand on my elbow now, and in the other he carried the kit bag that my ophthalmologist had told me to pack, but that the admitting nurse contended I wouldn't need. Tom finagled a private room, and once I was settled in, a dinner tray for himself, although I was only to sip water. There was the strange domesticity of the evening, the smell of food, the sound of the evening news on TV, the scrape of cutlery, and our back-and-forth conversation about ordinary things, while the hospital went about its noisy business of paging doctors and delivering medicines, and nurses came in now and again to offer this pre-op information or that. In the morning, a brown city dawn at the room's narrow, deep-set window, Tom was there again. But he had only touched my hand and kissed my scalp by way of greeting before they came to wheel me down to surgery. They took me in the same bed I had slept in, so that when they maneuvered it out the door and swung it around to head toward the elevator, I looked over my shoulder and waved goodbye to him as if I were a woman on a passing train. He stood alone in the now strangely empty room, not a bit of concern in his bright smile or his jaunty wave, but unabashed fear and sorrow in his eyes and across his high forehead. What followed was 10 days of blindness, They had bandaged both my eyes so that the healthy one would not go darting about, dragging along all inadvertently the one that had been repaired. It seemed a bit much, I told the doctor, but he assured me it was for the best. A little inconvenience now for a better outcome later. I recognized the wheedling phrase from my first labor when, at the height of the pain, the ether was withheld. A little patience now, the eye surgeon said, after he had been reduced by my blindness to a pair of dry fingertips and the odor of whatever he had on his breath, coffee or bacon in the morning, ketchup or onion if he came in after lunch, for a well-healed eye in the future. My eyes, I told him, the blindness making me raise my chin as I spoke, a bold piece, have never been well healed. But he was some kind of Eastern European and didn't get the play on words, only touched his puffy fingertips to my chin. Patience, he said. I said, a patient patient. And still he didn't respond, although somewhere in the room Tom and Gabe were laughing. Tom said, my wife, doctor, will always have the last word. Somewhere in the room during those days of bandaged darkness, my children sat, talking mostly to one another, mostly about where they had managed to park their cars and what time they had left home and what time they should head out again to avoid the traffic, tunnel or bridge, the Southern State or the LIE. I heard the bustle of their winter clothes, zip and unzip, buckle and snap. There was the jingle of car keys and the odor of exhaust. I listened to their familiar voices with a vague indifference, rattle and clink. It was my first sense of their lives going on without me. When I woke, I was sitting up in the bed. I had no way to tell the hour. I listened, neither the clatter of meal trays nor the smell of the outdoors on visitors' clothes, perhaps the quiet of a shift change or the still of late night or of very early morning. The sound of city traffic was hushed and sporadic enough to mean it was either late night or very early morning. The pillows were propped behind me, and my hands lay limply at my sides outside the thermal blanket, whose texture I had begun to know as a sighted person might know a familiar face. I searched for my voice, and even the tentative way I sought it reminded me of how a blind person might scuttle her hands towards something that had fallen just out of reach. Hello, I said finally, weakly enough, feeling foolish to be speaking to an empty room in the middle of the night or a good hour or two before they brought in breakfast, but adding, nevertheless, is anyone here? Giving into foolishness in order to avoid being overtaken by fear. I had a terrible, lonely image of myself in the white bed, my nose in the air, the gauze wrapped around my eyes. I pictured the lightless hospital room, but since it had been so long since I had seen this particular one, and had seen it only briefly even so, I could not be sure if the details were real or imagined, the actual place or a compilation of all the hospital rooms I had ever been in. I imagined the building around me, the dull pulse of all the sleeping bodies it contained, room after room, floor upon floor, above and below, something of Calvary, cemetery, of gate of heaven, about the rows of pale beds and all those strangers with their own troublesome eyes and ears, unconscious now, heads thrown back, mouths open, breathing softly into this gray light between night and day. I heard the sound of movement. Some distance from the bed, it seemed a breath and feather sound of soft movement from an unseen part of the unseen room. Me, a voice said hoarsely, and then, after a shy clearing of the throat, I'm here. I hesitated. I'll admit I was afraid. I felt my useless eyes moving behind the gauze. Who is? I said. The days of blindness had made my voice impatient and wary. I knew him, of course, by his laughter. Tom, he said. Who else? Thank you. . Got to practice that tone of a long marriage. What are you talking about? I guess we're going to open it up to you guys and questions or anything you'd like to talk about. Is that good? Bring the house lights up. Pressure's on Sarah. Sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. You know, for a long time, I just absolutely resisted this title. You know, it was felt generic, and you know, I'm sure I won't go back and look at it, but I'm sure I had all kinds of comments in my notebook, like, you can't do better than that, you know, not very intriguing. And I think I was using it as a working title, you know, pretty much keep that on hold until something really brilliant and intriguing and with deep literary meaning to show how smart I am comes to you. But no, that was the title, and the title stayed, and for a number of reasons. One was it struck me that by using this single word as a title, it has the effect, at least for me as a reader, and I would hope for other readers, of almost italicizing the word every time it appears within the novel. And it's sort of amazing how many times, and it was not something that I planned so much that I was going back and inserting it. So that when you look at how many different ways the word appears in the novel, it's from the very beginning in the first chapter, there's a girl next door when Marie's just a little girl, Pegeen Shahab, who's Irish and Syrian, and she stops to tell Marie that she's been falling, doesn't know why, she thinks she's clumsy, and then she says, but there's always someone nice. Someone always helps me up. Not too long after that, because I hope I'm not giving everything away to you, but if I am, oh what? Read it for the language, not for the surprise. But not too long after that, Pegeen actually has her last fall down the stairs and either breaks her neck or has been dying all along. And Marie's older brother, Gabe, who is the golden boy of this immigrant Irish family because he's good looking and smart, and he recites poetry, and he's going to be a priest. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that for this family. In order to comfort his parents after they've been over to Pegeen's house for the wake, Gabe opens up his Bible and reads from Matthew. About are not two sparrows sold for a small coin, and yet not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's notice. Even the hairs on your head are counted. You are worth more than many sparrows. To which little Marie, 7 years old and sort of tired of all this adulation that her brother gets, responds with a word that Pegeen had just given her the day before, and that is Amadon, which means fool. Gabe, as she says, the scholar, doesn't know what Amadon means and asks his father, and the father says, it means a fool. It means someone's a fool. So that's just two examples of how the word sort of on its own, in conjunction with this title, resonates just a tiny bit. So that's when I realized that this title was very much a fabric of thematic things and stories. And then there's all kinds of ways of playing with it. To be someone, you know. I'm just I'm just a no one or I'm a someone, and playing with that. Although my own dear Irish mother keeps saying, "What's the name of that new novel? No One." Yeah, she wrote this book called No One. I mean, I don't know. um, so I realized it was one of those, I mean, really right up to when actually, I love my publisher and they're wonderful people and I've been with them for a long time. But every once in a while, they sort of look at me the way my mother does, and say, "Why are you here?" And they even kind of said, "Are you sure about that title, Someone? You think that's gonna really sell?" But it was tied so tied to the novel that after a while, it almost feels like it's not your choice anymore. Yeah, that's the title of the novel, and everything else is out of my hands. Now I can see you. Hello. Sure.
All of your works are in New York, right? But you don't live anymore in New York, right?
Right.
You can't move, though.
Do you mean, do I want to go back to New York?
That's where you write. That's the important place to write about.
Well, that's funny. I mean, yes and no. It's a place I know. I mean, I grew up in New York. I haven't lived in New York since I went away to college. That was upstate New York, but that's a different animal. No, I haven't lived in New York since then, or I haven't lived full time. Have stopped back on occasion and lingered. But that's material at hand. It's a place I know. I know the inflections of the people who grow up there. I have a sense of the geography. But I would not use it for fiction unless I felt it was doing something more than that. I mean, I don't feel like I'm not following in James Joyce's footsteps and hoping that a map of Brooklyn could be drawn out of my novel. This Brooklyn is not the real Brooklyn. This is this character's Brooklyn. This is looking at a place from the inside out. Unless place can provide something more than just scenes for the novel, I grow bored with it in my own writing. So here it's a very small place. It's a small town. It's community. It's the street. There's not an awful lot of Brooklyn. There's no Brooklyn politics. She doesn't go to Ebbets Field. It's because this is really how she is nurtured as a character, and that comes from that neighborhood. But it comes from that, not just that neighborhood, but the era, not just the time and place, but the genetics, all those things working together to make her who she is. So I'm not particularly interested. I mean, I didn't go back to Brooklyn and walk the streets and say, okay, this is where Marie was sitting and this is where she. It's an imagined place because for me it feeds character. That's what fiction does. I mean, journalism, nonfiction has to say, yeah, it happened on this street, but fiction writers can say, because she was this character, or because he was like this, it happened on that street, or it happened in this place. Character comes first, and we can fudge it. It doesn't have to be the particulars. I mentioned that there's a church. Her church that she goes to is Mary Star of the Sea. There are two Mary Stars of the Sea in Brooklyn, two actual churches, and it's neither one of them. The geography doesn't quite work out. She's too close to downtown, and but that's the name of the church that forms her. Mary Star of the Sea is really important for a book about a woman who has no voice, an ordinary, recognizable woman. The very notion of Mary, and she should have been Mary, but she's Marie because her mother heard the George M. Cohan song that said, in society with propriety, they say Marie, and she really wanted society and propriety. So as the father says, Blessed Virgin Mary, step aside, she's going to be Marie, but she was supposed to be Mary. But the notion of Mary, Star of the sea. How exalted can a woman's name be? So for a character who is not exalted in her own life, it was very important to me that she didn't go to St. Peter's or St. James or the church that, had I drawn a grid of the actual Brooklyn and said, well, if she's sitting here on Dean Street, she probably would have gone to St. Peter's. Doesn't mean anything to me. That's the real world. If I were happy with the real world, I wouldn't write fiction. I write fiction because the real world is not neat, and doesn't make any sense, and I want to redo it so that it makes sense. So something as simple as the church that she goes to feeds her vision of herself, and something that I hope the entire novel expresses. So yeah, I've written about New York and may always write about New York, but I don't have any particular interest in the place except how it feeds story or character or theme. Yes? Thank you. Could you hear that question about the rhythm of prose? I guess anybody's prose, but I'm here, so I got to talk about my prose. Eudora Welty says something that I just love, and I have to confess, and I should really do a Google search. I don't know exactly in what context she said this, but I found it somewhere at one point, and I copied it down and didn't cite it. That's what kind of scholar I am. But she was talking about sort of when you're, she didn't say in the groove, but when you're in the groove of your writing, she said when you hit that point where you know the sound of the next sentence before you know what the words are. And I think that's tied to voice, and certainly your own prose style, voice and diction and structure all comes out of that. But for me, that's one of the essential and initial things, to hear the voice of the story, whether it's first person or third or omniscient or multiple points of view or however, but just to hear the music of it. Someone is telling a story, but not simply relating events, but the events are being put together. They're being composed, as I like to think of it, into a whole, into an artistic whole, so that, we hope that from the first sentence, a note is struck that will reverberate to the last. And I think that very much comes through hearing the language, and also giving, and I think this is what you're talking about, the role of the subconscious, sort of giving over to the language, not taking ideas about things, points I want to make, something I have to say about the Catholic Church or women in the 1940s or whatever, and letting that be primary, but rather letting the language be primary, and when seeking that rhythm, even before you know what the words are, to be true to the rhythm and let the words come as they may, and learn from that, so that your own story begins to, you begin to really be your own first reader. Your own story can surprise you. It can, things can happen, details can arrive that have meaning that you hadn't anticipated. And all that, I think, is that inner ear of getting the prose right. It's one of the hardest things to teach young writers, and I'm always quoting this line, and this line I can cite. This is Seamus Heaney. It's a line from his poem, The Gravel Walk, but he also used it in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech when talking to young poets. And he says, "We must teach ourselves to walk on air against our better judgment." And I think in the composition process, that's that scary but wonderful point where, as writer, you put yourself at the service of your story, of your character. You don't really know where you're going. You're just listening and hoping that your intuition or your subconscious or whoever, whatever, will lead you to the right place. But it's just that letting go. And I think all artists have to do that letting go of ego and stepping off into the darkness and hoping somewhere there'll be light. Yes.
There's a scene where Tom talks about his experience as a POW, and he remembers a sermon that Gabe gave. And it struck me as a possible theme in the book of grace, kind of underlying, as if someone was there to catch us. Would you want to comment on, is that a possible theme of the book?
Oh, yeah, yeah. See, I'm not subtle at all. It's all there. Yeah, I mean, there are so many characters falling in this book. It's like, oh, I get it. Sparrows falling, girls falling down the stairs, Tom falls out of a plane, It's, but yes, certainly. That's and it's really the theme that is struck in that first tension between Gabe and Marie, when he says, "You are worth more than many sparrows," and she says, "Fool, Amadon, you're a fool." And that tension between not just that belief, don't even have to take it as far as faith, but as a proposition, even as a proposition, to say that not a single sparrow falls without your Father's knowledge. That is an outrageous proposition. And anyone who puts it against the history of humankind and all the anonymous deaths that accumulate, and as anonymous as sparrows, and to say there is a creator, a father, or anyone who notices every single one of those, the tension, of course you're a fool. You're a fool to even propose such a thing. And so the tension between those two things, in many ways, is I think, probably the surest underlining theme of the book. And Tom comes in sort of, at one point, Marie's mother says, "I'll have you stand between these two, the pious brother and the little pagan who Marie is." And he had that experience. And the thing he loves about the sermon, it was a sermon on Jesus curing the blind man, but the blind man didn't ask to be cured. And Tom said he kind of liked that, that you don't have to have, and yet things happen to you. You don't have to have faith. You don't have to ask for anything, and yet things happen. And there's a kind of grace that appears in your life almost inadvertently. There's always someone nice. You meet someone, and someone may be a fool. So it is, for me, that's very much the heart of the book, the tension between the two. And what I was interested in is, how does that tension play out over an entire life? Are there moments when that grace becomes so apparent? And will she see it? Marie, as I say, there's nothing subtle here. Marie is thick glasses when she's 7, and there's lots of things she sees that other people see, and there's lots of things that she misses. And that's all a part of it, that grace that comes to us even if we don't ask for it, and yet we're caught. Even Marie, at the very end of her life, there's someone there to catch her. Yes. That's right, yeah. So, I mean, again, I didn't write the book as a tract. I didn't write the book to make a point, but to discover, and I had to write the whole thing to find out for myself. In this one life, in this one particular life, this one ordinary, very particular life, where are those, are there those moments when that ridiculous proposal that someone, Father, Creator, sees even the sparrow fall, can almost be believed, almost seems right, as foolish as it seems most other times. I had someone say to me at a reading recently, which was sort of touching for me, that she had just read the book just when the videos were coming back from Syria about the gas attacks, and there were pictures of all the bodies, and many of them children, wrapped up and lying. And she said, because the book was fresh in her mind, she said as soon as she saw them lined up, she thought sparrows. they looked, just the way they were, and I said, that wasn't me, that was Matthew. That sparrow metaphor, it's not mine. And I looked around, I wouldn't be struck by lightning for taking credit for another writer's work. Are we good? Thank you so much for coming out, and safe home.